In the early 1400s, Portuguese sailors landed on an island so densely forested, so relentlessly steep, and so completely lacking in flat, farmable land that early accounts describe settlers having to set entire hillsides on fire just to clear enough space to grow their first crops. There was no level ground to speak of, no obvious way to farm terrain this vertical, and no fresh water, reliably reaching the driest parts of the island at all. And yet, 600 years later, that same impossible island has become one of the most celebrated destinations in the entire Atlantic. Its terraced hillsides producing world-famous wine, its cliffs drawing travelers from across the globe, its capital hosting fireworks displays so massive they hold an official world record. This is Madeira, and its story is really a story about turning nearly every disadvantage nature handed it into something extraordinary. Picture an island discovered completely uninhabited, covered edge to edge in dense ancient forest so thick that early settlers reportedly burned parts of it for years just to open up enough land to survive. Picture that same unforgiving, near-vertical terrain eventually transformed into thousands of small, hand-built stone terraces, watered by an extraordinary network of narrow channels carved directly into cliff faces to move water from the wet side of the island to the dry side. And picture a place so committed to celebrating its own unlikely success that its New Year's Eve fireworks show has been officially recognized as the largest on Earth. How did settlers turn one of the most physically punishing landscapes in the Atlantic into a place millions of people now dream of visiting? Let's find out. Madeira sits in the North Atlantic Ocean, roughly 1,000 kilometers southwest of mainland Portugal and a few hundred kilometers off the coast of Morocco, an archipelago formed entirely by volcanic activity. Its main island, rising dramatically out of deep ocean water in a series of jagged peaks and steep-walled valleys, the summit of an underwater mountain whose true base sits thousands of meters below the surface, meaning the visible island represents only a small fraction of the geological structure actually holding it up. When Portuguese explorers, sailing under the direction of Prince Henry, the navigator, first reached the island around 1419, blown off course toward the smaller neighboring island of Porto Santo before sighting Madeira itself the following year, they found it completely uninhabited, blanketed almost entirely in dense Laura Silva forest, an ancient type of subtropical woodland that once covered much of southern Europe, before ice ages wiped it out almost everywhere except a handful of surviving Atlantic islands like this one. In fact, the island's very name comes directly from the Portuguese word for wood, a fitting label for a place early settlers found buried beneath so much timber that clearing it became their first, most urgent challenge. The felled cedar and yew trees themselves eventually milled into planks and shipped back to mainland Portugal and Spain as a valuable export in their own right. That challenge turned out to be genuinely dramatic. According to early historical accounts, settlers cleared portions of Madeira's forest using controlled burns, fires reportedly significant enough that later legend held they smoldered for years across parts of the island. An origin story that, whether taken literally or as exaggeration passed down through generations, still captures just how aggressively the first colonists had to fight the island's dense, overwhelming vegetation simply to create room for basic agriculture. Once cleared, the land presented an entirely different problem. Madeira's terrain is so steep and mountainous that almost none of it offered naturally flat ground suitable for farming at any real scale. Rather than giving up on agriculture entirely, Madeira's early settlers responded by essentially reshaping the island's slopes by hand. Across the 15th and 16th centuries, and continuing for generations afterward, islanders built thousands of small, narrow terraces, known locally as poios, carved directly into hillsides and supported by dry-stacked basalt retaining walls, creating flat, workable strips of arable soil stacked one above another up otherwise unusable mountainsides. The scale of that undertaking is genuinely difficult to overstate. Entire mountainsides, in places rising at angles that would challenge even a determined hiker, were methodically reshaped into staircases of cultivable land, each wall built stone by stone without mortar, relying purely on the weight and careful placement of the basalt rock itself to hold back the soil behind it, a technique passed down and refined across generations of farmers who had no other realistic option for growing anything at all. Even today, flying into Madeira reveals a landscape almost entirely reshaped by that centuries-old effort. Hillsides striped with these narrow green terraces climbing steeply from the coastline toward the island's cloud-covered peaks. A landscape that looks less like natural farmland and more like an enormous, painstakingly constructed staircase, evidence, at every turn, of just how much manual labor it took to make an island this vertical productive at all. Terraces alone couldn't solve Madeira's other fundamental problem, though: water. The island's mountainous interior captures abundant rainfall on its northern side, while the southern coast, where most early settlement and agriculture concentrated, remained comparatively dry, a natural imbalance that made otherwise fertile southern land essentially useless without some way to bring water across the island's central mountain range. To solve that imbalance, islanders built one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in the entire Atlantic world: an extensive network of narrow irrigation channels called levadas, carved directly into cliff faces and tunneled through solid rock, designed to carry water gradually downhill from the wet northern mountains across to the dry southern farmland, sometimes stretching for dozens of kilometers along routes that required workers to be lowered down sheer cliff faces on ropes simply to carve out the channel by hand, chiseling narrow passages through solid basalt. One painstaking meter at a time, work considered so dangerous that it was, for long stretches of the island's history, carried out disproportionately by enslaved and forced laborers assigned to the task, constructed gradually over centuries, largely through private initiative by landowners who needed the water, organized into cooperative associations of shareholding farmers who jointly maintained and managed each channel, and later expanded with government support once economic pressures made state investment necessary. The levada system eventually grew to cover well over 2,000 kilometers of channels, crisscrossing the island, an engineering feat so extensive and so central to Madeira's survival that the network remains, to this day, one of the primary reasons the island's agriculture was ever able to function at all. Those same levada paths, originally built purely for irrigation, have since become one of Madeira's most beloved tourist attractions. Narrow walking trails tracing the water channels through dense forest and along dramatic cliffside routes that offer some of the most spectacular hiking anywhere in Europe, drawing visitors specifically to walk alongside the very same water system that quietly transformed the island 6 centuries ago. With water finally reaching the terraced hillsides, Madeira's economy took off, first through wheat, which sustained a small but growing population through the mid-15th century, and then, as cereal yields began declining under the strain of the island's thin volcanic soil, through a crop that would transform the island's fortunes entirely: sugarcane. Introduced with financial backing from Genoese bankers and technical expertise brought in from Sicily, sugar cultivation exploded across Madeira's terraces, and by the 16th century, the island had become one of the most significant sugar producers anywhere in the world. Its harvest so valuable at the time that it earned the nickname white gold, prized enough across Europe that Madeira briefly rivaled far larger sugar-producing regions despite its tiny size. That sugar boom brought genuine prosperity to the island, funding churches, grand houses, and civic buildings that still stand in Funchal today. But it also brought a far darker chapter, since, like much of the early Atlantic sugar economy, Madeira's plantations relied in part on enslaved labor, workers brought from North Africa and, increasingly, West Africa, forced to work the same fields and levada construction sites that had transformed the island's landscape. A difficult historical thread woven directly into the same agricultural success story that shaped Madeira's early prosperity. One historian's note took a somewhat different form here than the larger-scale plantation slavery that would later define the Americas, often smaller in scale and frequently domestic in nature, though no less a genuine and painful part of the island's early economic history. As sugar production eventually declined and shifted to larger, more efficient producers elsewhere in the Atlantic world, particularly once Brazil and the Caribbean began producing sugar at a scale Madeira's limited, terraced land simply couldn't match. The island found a new identity in something that would ultimately define its global reputation far more enduringly: wine. Madeira, wine, a fortified wine uniquely produced using a deliberate heating and aging process originally discovered almost by accident, when barrels shipped on long ocean voyages through tropical heat were found to have developed a richer, more complex flavor. As a result of that extended exposure to warmth and gentle movement, became one of the island's most celebrated exports, prized historically enough that it reportedly featured in toasts at the signing of America's Declaration of Independence, and remained popular enough among American colonists that George Washington himself was said to be a regular admirer of the drink. The wine industry remains central to Madeira's identity and economy today. Grape harvests still gathered each late summer across those same centuries-old stone terraces, celebrated annually with festivals that draw both locals and visitors into the vineyards. For traditional grape treading and open-air tastings, a direct, living continuation of an industry that has shaped the island's economy for the better part of 5 centuries. Modern Madeira has built much of its identity and economy around exactly the dramatic landscape its earliest settlers once had to fight so hard to tame. Cabo Hiron, along the island's southern coast, ranks among the highest sea cliffs in Europe, plunging nearly 600 meters almost straight down to the ocean below, a drop so sheer that a glass-bottomed skywalk built out over the edge lets visitors look straight down through their own feet to the waves crashing far beneath them. A small but striking piece of engineering that has turned what was once simply a dramatic natural boundary into one of the island's most photographed attractions. Remarkably, even the base of that towering cliff hosts a small patch of terraced farmland, accessible only by cable car or boat, still cultivated today, much as it has been for generations. A vivid illustration of just how far Madeira's farmers were willing to go to claim usable land wherever they could find it. Funchal, the island's capital and largest city, wraps around a natural amphitheater-shaped bay on the southern coast. Its narrow cobbled streets, historic cathedral dating back to the 15th century, and bustling farmers market, giving the city a genuinely distinctive character shaped by centuries of maritime trade and colonial history. Its steep surrounding hillsides climbing so sharply from the harbor that a network of cable cars, and even a traditional wicker toboggan ride, guided by two men in straw hats steering passengers down a winding cobbled street, remains one of the city's most enduringly popular attractions. The city has also become globally recognized for reasons that have nothing to do with its landscape at all. Funchal is the hometown of footballer Cristiano Ronaldo, one of the most famous athletes on the planet, and the island's airport now carries his name, a facility itself notable for an unusual engineering feat of its own. Its runway extended out over the ocean on massive concrete stilts, simply because, once again, Madeira's terrain offered no naturally flat stretch of land long enough to safely land a modern jet. Alongside the airport, a museum dedicated to Ronaldo's career has become one of the island's most visited modern attractions, drawing football fans from around the world to an island that, 6 centuries earlier, nobody had ever even set foot on at all. Perhaps nothing captures Madeira's flair for transforming everyday events into genuine spectacle, quite like its New Year's Eve celebration. Each year, Funchal's harbor and surrounding hillsides host a massive fireworks display, synchronized across the entire bay and visible from boats, hillside viewpoints, and hotel terraces stretched around the natural amphitheater of the city itself, a show so large in scale that it earned official recognition from Guinness World Records back in 2006 as the largest fireworks display anywhere on the planet, a title the island has continued to build on in the years since, drawing thousands of visitors specifically to witness the spectacle each year, many booking hotel rooms and boat charters a year or more in advance just to secure a decent view. The island's steep, bowl-shaped geography, turning what might elsewhere be a simple fireworks show into something closer to a natural amphitheater built specifically for the occasion. Madeira has since carried that same appetite for spectacle into the rest of its annual calendar as well, hosting a month-long summer celebration built around an international fireworks competition, a springtime flower festival that fills Funchal's streets with elaborate floral parades, and a boisterous carnival celebration each winter, evidence of an island culture that has learned across centuries of hard, patient labor simply to survive, to also genuinely celebrate the results of that effort with real enthusiasm. Daily life for Madeira's roughly 250,000 residents today reflects a genuine blend of that deep agricultural heritage and a modern economy now dominated overwhelmingly by tourism. Small-scale farming continues across many of the island's traditional terraces, families still cultivating grapes for wine production alongside bananas, a crop that thrives in Madeira's mild subtropical climate and remains one of the island's significant agricultural exports, even as younger generations increasingly move toward hospitality, services, and other tourism-driven work, concentrated heavily around Funchal and the island's expanding network of hotels, resorts, and guest houses. That shift echoes an older pattern in Madeiran history as well, since for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, economic hardship and limited opportunity at home pushed successive waves of Madeirans to immigrate abroad, building sizable communities in places like Venezuela, South Africa, and the Hawaiian Islands, where Madeiran immigrants and their distinctive 4-string braguinha instrument are widely credited with helping introduce what would eventually evolve into the modern ukulele, an unexpected cultural export from an island most of those distant communities' neighbors had likely never heard of at all. That mild, remarkably consistent climate, rarely dipping into genuine cold and rarely suffering extreme heat either, has earned Madeira the nickname the Island of Eternal Spring, a marketing phrase that also happens to be a fairly accurate description of conditions that continue drawing visitors and increasingly remote workers and retirees to settle there for extended stretches of the year, taking advantage of reliable internet access and Portugal's broader appeal as a destination for long-term relocation from colder parts of Europe and beyond. None of Madeira's success has come without real, ongoing challenges. The island's dramatic terrain, the very feature that makes it so visually spectacular, also means usable, buildable land remains genuinely scarce, driving housing costs upward as tourism demand continues climbing, a familiar tension in popular destinations worldwide, but one made sharper here by the sheer physical limits of the landscape itself. Madeira's steep, forested slopes also remain vulnerable to wildfires, particularly during increasingly hot, dry summer stretches linked to a changing climate, fires that pose genuine risk both to remaining pockets of the island's ancient, UNESCO-protected Laura Silva forest and to communities built into hillsides that offer few easy evacuation routes, and an island whose entire agricultural and economic history was built around overcoming water. Scarcity continues to watch that same challenge evolve as rain falls. Patterns shift, and demand from both agriculture and a growing tourism sector place new pressure on the very levada system settlers, first built by hand centuries ago. What makes Madeira's story so compelling isn't simply that the island turned out beautiful, since plenty of naturally stunning places exist around the world without requiring centuries of relentless human effort just to become livable in the first place. It's that almost nothing about Madeira's beauty happened by accident. The terraces climbing its hillsides, the water channels threading through its cliffs, the vineyards producing its famous wine, all of it exists because generations of settlers looked at one of the most physically unforgiving landscapes in the Atlantic and simply refused to accept that it couldn't be made to work. Paradise on Madeira was never simply discovered. It was carved terrace by terrace, channel by channel, directly into the mountain itself. If Madeira's transformation from an impossible forested rock into one of the Atlantic's most celebrated islands surprised you, subscribe, because there are more places out there where the most beautiful landscapes turn out to be the ones people had to fight the hardest to build.